Hello, this is the lecture on prosocial behavior. Let me tell you two stories. So, in the early 1960s in Queens, New York, a woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked while walking to her car and brutally murdered in an alley next to an apartment complex. The attack lasted 45 minutes, and no fewer than 38 of the apartment residents around the block admitted later that they had rushed to their windows after hearing Kitty's screams for help. However, not one of these apartment dwellers attempted to help her, and none of them bothered to call the police. In January 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Most of the passengers and crew were killed by the impact, but a few survivors clung to the tail section of the plane in the frigid waters. A rescue helicopter quickly arrived to help the survivors, but most of the survivors were so much in shock that they failed to grab the line as it swung back and forth in the wind. One passenger, though, who was later identified as Arlen Williams, who was a bank examiner in his 50s, was more alert than others and managed to catch the rope. And instead of letting it pull him to safety, he passed the line to another passenger. And each time the line returned, he would hand it to someone else. One survivor lost her grip on the rope and fell into the water. And Lenny Skutnik, who you see in the picture here on the right, who was a clerk at the Congressional Budget Office, was watching off the banks of the Potomac and, without hesitation, jumped into the water to save her, which he did. Meanwhile, the helicopter continued to tow the other survivors to shore. And when it came back for Mr. Williams finally, he was nowhere to be found. He had succumbed to the freezing temperatures, slipped into the water, and drowned. So, what do both of these cases have in common? Well, what is common in each of these cases was that there was someone in need of help. And in one case, people helped. In the other case, people didn't. Why is this? Well, this is the subject. Answering these questions of why people help and why people do not help is basically the fundamental question of the social psychology of prosocial behavior. Prosocial behavior is defined as any behavior performed by one person that benefits another person. This can come in many forms, such as volunteering or giving money to charity, but most social psychological research focuses on direct helping, which is when a person directly helps another person or a group of people. Now, if you pay close attention, you'll note that this definition does not take into consideration the motives or reasons for doing the helpful behavior. Any behavior is prosocial behavior if the action has positive consequences for the person helped. That's why I say we're studying prosocial behavior and not altruism, which many people think is the same thing. Altruism is defined as helping that is intended to provide aid to someone else without expectation of any reward and or if it involves cost or anything like that to the helper. A behavior can be prosocial even when it's altruistic, like when a person helps another because he thinks he will receive some reward for doing so. Now, it may seem I'm just splitting hairs here, distinguishing between prosocial behavior and altruism, but you'll see why I'm doing this later on in this lecture. There are social psychologists who study prosocial behavior tend to try to answer one of the following 5 questions. The first is, why do people help? That is, where does the ultimate fundamental motivation to help others come from? The second question is, who do people help? That is, what are the characteristics of others that influence whether or not people will help these others? Third, what factors determine whether people will help? That is, what are the things about us and around us that influence whether or not we decide to help others in need? Fourth, when will people help? That is, if a person is in the presence of a situation in which another needs help, when will this person actually help? And finally, how do people react to being helped? That is, what do people think and how do they feel when they've been helped by others? So let's start out with the first question, which is, why do people help? Why do we even observe what we call prosocial behavior in the first place? Prosocial behavior hasn't been observed in many species of animals, so that means we don't necessarily have to act prosocially at all. And to answer this question, we have to understand the underlying reasons why people are even willing to consider helping others. So let's look at some of the answers given to this question of why we actually help. One answer to the question of why we actually help is our evolutionary heritage. The reason we humans act prosocially is because the tendency to act prosocially gave early humans a survival and reproductive advantage. Because of these advantages, we today have inherited the tendency to act prosocially. Of course, helping others seems at odds with survival. Giving others precious resources, especially in the quite barren ancestral environment, means having less resources needed to survive. If I'm an early human who has 3 apples and I give two other of my apples to other people, that means I might not have enough an apple to eat tomorrow or the next day when I haven't been able to find any other food. So helping these others seems to have made my odds of survival shrink. Now, the existence of prosocial behavior was a tricky subject for a long time for evolutionary theorists, at least initially. But prosocial behavior began to make sense from an evolutionary perspective when you start thinking of genes as selfish. Of course, genes don't have consciousness, so they can't be selfish. But calling genes selfish is just a metaphor that captures the idea that, in the end, natural selection works for the survival of genes, not individual organisms. That is, genes make decisions to make sure they are passed down to the next generation, that they continue to exist, whatever organism carrying them be damned. This helps to explain the fact that organisms, including humans, often do many things, including prosocial behavior, that might be bad for the individual organism in terms of survival, but good for survival of the genes that that organism is carrying. To help you think about how genes can be selfish, I'll take an example from the world of spiders. Many male spiders let female spiders eat them after copulation. Now, why would a male spider do such a thing? Well, because by allowing the female spider he just mated with to eat him, he provides her with nutrition that will allow her to survive, have offspring, and thus pass his genes into the next generation. And so the genes of that spider were selfish. It did not give a damn about the individual spider. It cares about passing on its genes to the next generation and doing whatever it can to make sure that happens. And in much the same way, humans sometimes help, even though it might be to their personal detriment, because such behavior allows their genes to be passed on into the next generation. Evolutionary social psychologists have given two big explanations for why prosocial behavior would have given early humans a survival and reproductive advantage. The first is the idea of inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is the recognition that helping others who share a significant fraction of one's genes helps transmit one's genes into future generations. Inclusive fitness is reflected in the idea of kin selection, which is a tendency for people to help those who share more of their genes than those who share less or none of their genes, especially in life or death situations. That is, people are more likely to help a brother than a cousin, and they are more likely to help a cousin than a mother in law, especially in life and death situations. The idea of kin selection was famously captured in the phrase, I will lay down my life for two brothers or eight cousins. Two brothers because brothers share half of one's genes, and cousins share uh, about 12.5% of one's genes. And there is some evidence for kin selection. For example, in one study, researchers had participants read various stories of people in need of help in life and death situations. And in some stories, the people who needed help were relatives, and in others, they were non relatives. The researchers found that as the amount of genetic similarity increased, so too did the odds of the participants saying they would help. That is, people were more likely to say they would help their brother than their cousin, and they were more likely to say they would help their cousin than an unrelated neighbor. Kin selection also predicts that people are more likely to help genetic relatives who are young than those who are old. Why? Well, because younger relatives have more potential fertility left than older relatives. So, kin selection predicts that if a house is ablaze and both grandma and young sister are in there, people are going to make a beeline for their younger sister because little sister still has a lot of opportunity left to make babies, while grandma doesn't. Of course, all of this is happening at an unconscious level. People aren't consciously deciding whether to help a person based on genetic similarity and fertility considerations. You got to remember, these are tendencies we have inherited and thus make us act in ways even if we don't realize it, at least according to the explanations given. Explanation for prosocial behavior from an evolutionary social psychological perspective is that the chances of survival increase when people share resources with others, including non kin, and because of this, we today have inherited the tendency to help others. In the ancestral environment, there was strength in numbers, so to speak. The more people who belonged to the group and would be willing to look out and share resources with each other, the more likely this group would have survived than lone individuals or very small kin groups. Because sharing with others, including sharing with non kin, was advantageous for early humans in terms of survival, early humans who would share with others were better able to pass down their genes to the next generation. And thus today we have inherited the tendency to act prosocially towards others. This explanation would explain the existence of something that exists in every society and social group documented around the world, and that is the norm of reciprocity. The norm of reciprocity is the expectation that people's actions towards others must be returned in kind by these others. This idea is succinctly captured in the phrase, if I scratch your back, you must scratch mine. Centered is found in pretty much every society and social group documented. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that humans have the innate tendency to follow and enforce this norm. Most of us follow the norm of reciprocity, in that we feel obligations to help others who have helped us. And we also enforce this norm by punishing others who violate this norm. Now, according to evolutionary social psychologists, the reason we have inherited this tendency to follow and enforce the norm of reciprocity is because it was a middle ground, so to speak, between being completely selfish and being completely exploited. In the ancestral environment, completely selfish individuals living on their own or just with their immediate family group would have had a harder time surviving than a group of humans who had learned to cooperate and share resources with others outside their immediate kin group. For example, if a person was selfish and didn't have any food, then he would have a hard time finding others to help him. However, a person who shared his food with non-kin others when he had found some himself, when he had found himself without something to eat, because of his past sharing, he would probably find others who would share some food with him. However, early humans who too readily gave up their resources would have been exploited and thus less likely to survive. For instance, if a person gave all his food to anybody who asked for it, he would eventually starve. But if a person would only share his food with specific people, he would have some left over for himself. Thus, environmental conditions selected for a tendency in humans that falls in between being purely selfish and being a pure chump, so to speak, which was to help others with the expectation that they will help in the future and do not help those who have not returned help in the past, i.e., following the norm of reciprocity. Because early human ancestors who followed the reciprocity norm had a greater chance of survival than selfish humans and chump humans, humans inherited the tendency to follow the norm of reciprocity. Another answer to the question of why we help is because of selfishness. That is, the reason why we help is not ultimately to help others, but to help ourselves. Sure, there are positive outcomes for those who received help, but this is just a byproduct of the self-serving motivations of the helper. To put it another way, people perform prosocial behavior to receive rewards and or avoid punishments. Rewards for helping include both material and non-material things, including experiencing positive emotions, getting rid of negative emotions, impressing others, fame, and fortune. Punishments for not helping are experiences of guilt and shame, loss of status within a community, and even imprisonment. Some communities have actually implemented what are called Good Samaritan laws that punish and thus increase the cost to bystanders who do not help others. Good old Abe Lincoln actually believed that people helped for selfish reasons. One day, while riding in a stagecoach, Lincoln and a fellow passenger were debating the question, is prosocial behavior ever truly altruistic? Lincoln argued that people always help for selfish reasons, whereas the other passenger took the view that true altruism exists. Now, while they were riding, suddenly they were interrupted by the screeching whine of a mama pig who was trying to save her piglets from a drowning creek. Lincoln asked the driver to stop, and he jumped out of the coach, ran down to the creek, and saved the piglets. When he returned, all wet and muddy, his companion said, "Now, Abe, where does selfishness come in on this little episode?" And Lincoln responded, "Why, bless your soul, Ed, that was the very essence of selfishness. I should have had no peace of mind all day had I gone on and let that suffering old sow worry over those pigs. I did it to get a peace of mind, don't you see?" Several lines of evidence support the notion that prosocial behavior is ultimately selfish. For example, several studies have found that people don't tend to help where the potential costs of helping are high. For example, in one field experiment, the researchers had a confused looking actor ask a big muscular actor on a New York City subway whether the train was going uptown or downtown. The muscular man was told to give the wrong answer every time. Now, in some situations, the researcher had the muscular actor be physically threatening, and they did this by having the muscular man threaten a person who tripped over his feet right before the request was made. And that person who tripped over his feet was, of course, another actor. In other situations, they had the muscular man be verbally threatening. And in other situations, the muscular man wasn't threatening at all. And the experimenters did all this because they wanted to see if people would help by giving corrected information, even when it might not be in the best interest to do so, in that the very muscular, very big man might physically or verbally attack them. That is, they predicted that people would be less inclined to help when people perceived the potential cost of helping as high. And as you can see here, the results supported their hypothesis. When the muscular man wasn't intimidating at all, in over half the trials, someone spoke up and gave the correct directions. However, when the man was sometimes intimidating, in only 28% of the trials did someone speak up and give the correct directions. And this went down to 16% when the man was very threatening. Another line of evidence for the idea that prosocial behavior is ultimately selfish comes from research that shows that people often help to relieve negative emotions. This is based on what's called the negative state relief model, which argues that people have an innate drive to reduce negative emotions, and that leads them to perform behaviors that reduce these negative emotions. And one way that people can relieve their negative emotions is by helping others. Helping others often provides rewards to people that can make them feel better emotionally. And knowing this, people experiencing negative emotions will often seek out opportunities to help to receive these rewards. So, in this case, people aren't helping others just out of the kindness of their hearts, so to speak, but they're helping others to help themselves. A particular negative emotion that often motivates helping behavior is guilt. Guilt is the feeling that one has violated one's ethical and moral principles. Guilt often motivates prosocial behavior because prosocial behavior is a way to compensate for past immoral behavior. That guilt can motivate prosocial behavior was shown in an experiment where a person went up to strangers with an expensive looking camera and asked if these strangers would take a picture of him. Now, the camera was set up so it wouldn't work. And there were two conditions. In one condition, the person made the strangers feel as if they had broken the camera, hoping to cause feelings of guilt in the strangers. In the other condition, the person just said that the camera just acts up from time to time and that the strangers weren't responsible for this. And a little while later, the researchers had a person with a grocery bag that was spilling out candy from a hole in the bottom walk past these same people. And the researchers measured helping by how many of the people told the person about the hole in the bag. And as you can see here, making people feel guilty increased the likelihood they would help in the future. 55% of those made to feel guilty for quote unquote breaking the camera told the person about the hole in the bag, while only 15% of those not made to feel guilty did so. Another explanation given for why we even help in the first place is because we have the ability to empathize. Empathy is the capacity to share the emotional state of another and the ability to assess the reasons for another's emotional state. We have this ability, of course, because we are able to take the role of other people, as we've talked about several times already in this course. That is, we are able to put ourselves in the shoes of other people, so to speak, and understand what they are probably thinking and feeling when experiencing particular situations. Although there is some evidence that other animals, especially other primates, can be empathetic, it pales in comparison to humans' ability to be empathetic. The ability to empathize causes people to feel compassion and sympathy for those in need of help, and these feelings motivate helping behavior. For example, if a person encounters a homeless person, she can imagine what it might be like to be homeless and how hard and difficult that would be. Imagining this scenario would then lead this person to feel sympathy and compassion for the homeless person, and this would motivate her to help the person by giving money or a hot meal. And there is some evidence that when people empathize with the people that need help, they will help even if they don't have to. For example, in one experiment, people who said they could empathize with a person were very willing to help that person, even when they had the opportunity to escape the situation without any consequence. The next big question social psychologists try to answer about prosocial behavior is figuring out who people will help. That is, what are the characteristics of others that influence whether or not they will help these others? One characteristic of others that influences whether or not we will help these others is whether or not these others are in-group members. That is, people are more likely to help others who they perceive as belonging to the same groups that they belong to. Of course, this applies to one's family groups, as kin selection would predict. However, it also applies to the other groups that we belong to. So, Bears fans are more likely to help a fellow Bears fan than they are a Packers fan. A Christian is more likely to help a fellow Christian than a Muslim. And a Democrat is more likely to help a fellow Democrat than a Republican. People are also more likely to help those they are attracted to in some way. Basically, the same factors that increase liking towards others, like we've talked about previously, like propinquity, similarity, physical attractiveness, influence the odds of helping others. For example, several studies have shown that the more physically attractive a person is, the more likely people will help them. Our bias toward helping in-group members and people we like helps explain the patterns found regarding who we tend to help on a day-to-day basis. Overall, in everyday life, people say they help family and friends much more than they do other people, as you can see here in this table. So, as you see here, people in this study, people were asked to describe 4 or 5 situations in which they helped in some way, shape, or form in the past week. And as you see here, people most likely helped were friends and family, people they like, right? Roommates, very little. Acquaintances, very little. Um, Strangers, at least comparatively to how often friends and family were helped. Also, people are more likely to help those they believe are deserving of their help. This perceived worthiness often depends on whether people believe those in need of help are personally responsible for their predicament. The effects of perceived worthiness on helping behavior have been shown in several studies. For example, in one experiment, people were called and were asked for donations to help an elderly person because she had lost her job. In one condition, people were told the person lost her job because the position was being phased out. And in the other condition, people were told the person lost her job because she was caught stealing office supplies. People were much more likely to donate to help the person whose job was being phased out than the person who got fired for stealing. Also, in a series of experiments conducted on the New York City subway, experimenters had an actor fall down in a subway car. And there were two conditions. In one condition, the actor carried a cane and appeared physically disabled. And in the other, the actor carried a liquor bottle and reeked of whiskey. And as you can see here, the person with the cane was helped considerably more often than the person who appeared drunk. This is most likely because most people interpret a person having to walk with a cane as not responsible for their predicament because of a pre-existing condition or injury, while many people interpret a person who appears drunk as personally responsible for their own predicament. Question social psychologists try to answer about prosocial behavior is what factors determine whether people will help. That is, what are the things about us and around us that influence whether or not we decide to help others in need? And there are several factors that influence whether or not people decide to help. We can break these factors up into three types: personal characteristics, situational variables, and environmental factors. Let's first talk about personal characteristics that determine whether people will help. The first of these is personality. Having particular personality traits makes people more likely to help. In particular, those who are high in the personality trait of agreeableness tend to be helpful in a variety of contexts than those who are low in agreeableness. Those who are high in agreeableness value social harmony and getting along with others, and those who are low in agreeableness tend to be more self-interested and not too concerned about others. So it shouldn't come as no surprise that those who are high in agreeableness are more likely to help when opportunities arise than those who are low in agreeableness. Items on a common personality questionnaire that gauge how agreeable one is. And you can, you answer yes or no to these to figure out how much on the agreeableness scale you are. But questions like I am interested in people, I sympathize with others' feelings, I have a soft heart, I take time out for others, I feel others' emotions, I make people feel at ease, and sort of reversed questions that gauge agreeableness is I am not really interested in others, I insult people, I am not interested in other people's problems, I feel little concern for others. Another personality characteristic that influences helping is one's gender. Now, men and women are equally helpful in general. That is, if you just counted the number of times the average man and the average woman helped another person in the past week, it would be about the same. However, men and women differ in when they help. Men are more likely than women to help in dangerous life and death situations. That is, if there's a kid in a burning building, a man is more likely than a woman to run in and try to save the kid. On the other hand, women are more likely than men to help when the aid in need is caring, comfort, and emotional in nature. That is, if there's a person who needs someone to make them something to eat because he's sick, or if there's a person who needs a shoulder to cry on, so to speak, a woman is more likely than a man to provide the food or the shoulder to cry on. These gender differences in helping are most likely due to differences in gender socialization. Men are often taught that men should be quote unquote heroic and quote unquote risk taking. And so when there are situations where they can be a hero, like in a dangerous situation, many men won't be afraid to step up. On the other hand, women are taught to be nurturing, caring, and emotionally available. And thus, in situations where people need care, emotionally or otherwise, many women are prepared to help. Another personal characteristic that influences helping is one's religiousness. Religious people tend to be more helpful than those who are not religious. This shouldn't come as any surprise since most religions teach that people should be helpful to others. For example, in Christianity, Jesus told his followers, "Do unto others as you would have done to you." And the reason often cited for why religiousness is associated with prosocial behavior is because religious people feel that they are being supernaturally monitored at all times. Supernatural monitoring is the belief that one's actions are being observed by a supernatural agent, such as God, Allah, or Vishnu. Most people who believe in supernatural agents want them to do good things. And because of this, when people who believe their behavior is being watched by a supernatural agent, they will help others when such opportunities present themselves in order to make these supernatural agents happy. The idea that religious people are more helpful because of supernatural monitoring was shown in an experiment where researchers reminded participants of God by having them correct nonsense sentences that contain terms associated with supernatural agents, like spirit or God or divine. And the experimenters then had the respondents participate in a game in which they were given 10 $1 coins and told that they got to choose how many to keep and how many another participant would receive. And as you can see here, those who were reminded of God gave more money to the other person than people who were not reminded of God. Those that weren't reminded of God left an average of $2.56, while those who were reminded of God left on average $4.56. So $2 more. Now let's look at some of the situational factors that determine whether people will help. The first I want to talk about is the presence of helping models. When around others who are helping, people are more likely to help. For example, one experiment sent out people to donate a small amount to a Salvation Army Christmas kettle during regular intervals and measured how many people donated during that time. When a model was present, i.e., when they had another person donate into the kettle, 69 people donated. When the model wasn't present, only 43% donated. The presence of helping models increases the likelihood that people will help for three reasons. First, models convey that it is appropriate to help in the situation. As we'll see later, when in situations where someone needs help, people aren't actually sure if they need to do anything. However, the presence of another person helping or offering helps tell others, hey, I should help in this situation. Second, models demonstrate what prosocial actions are possible and effective. As we'll also see later, when in situations where someone needs help, people are often unsure what they should do. However, the presence of another person helping or offering help tells others, hey, I can do this action to help out here. Third, models provide information about potential rewards and cost of helping. For example, if a person sees someone helping and witnesses this person receive some reward for helping, the person learns that helping brings rewards and is thus more likely to help. Another situational variable that determines whether people will help are the emotions and moods people are feeling at a particular point in time. The experience of positive emotions such as happiness and being in a quote unquote good mood often motivates helping. People who are experiencing positive emotions and are in good moods tend to want to help to keep feeling that way. And one way they can do that, one way they can keep those emotions and moods up is by helping others. Helping others often provides rewards to people that can extend the experience of positive emotions and good moods. For example, holding the door open for a person carrying many packages often comes with a smile and a thank you, which can boost one's self-esteem and thus extend one's good mood. There are many things in our environment that can affect our emotions and moods and thus our tendency to help. For example, in one field experiment, researchers had people go up to strangers walking around a mall and ask them for a small favor. And there were two conditions. In one condition, the people approached strangers near stores in the mall that produced very nice smells, like a coffee shop, the Cinnabons, the Auntie Anne's pretzels. In the second condition, the people approached strangers near stores that smelled neutral, Banana Republic or Macy's. And the researchers also varied whether they approached men or women. And as you can see here, people were much more likely to do the favor when near stores that had nice smells than when they were approached near stores with no smells. The researchers interpreted these results by saying that being in the presence of nice smells puts people in good moods, and this increases the probability that they will help. So as you see here, when the nice smell, overwhelmingly more likely to help than when the smell was just neutral. But it's not just positive emotions and good moods that can motivate helping. Negative emotions and bad moods can motivate helping behavior too. As you hopefully remember, the negative state relief model argues that people often engage in prosocial behavior to make themselves feel better emotionally, like when people help to relieve themselves of feelings of guilt. Another situational variable that influences whether people will help is what media they have have been consuming at a particular point in time. People tend to be more prosocial after they have consumed media with prosocial themes and messages. For example, in one study, researchers had participants listen to either songs with prosocial messages or songs without a prosocial message. The songs with a prosocial message were Heal the World by Michael Jackson, We Are the World, sung by a bunch of stars in the 1980s, and Help by the Beatles. The neutral songs were On the Line by Michael Jackson, An Englishman in New York by Sting, and Octopus Garden by the Beatles. And after the participants listened to the music, an actor dropped a box of pencils. And the researchers measured helping by how many pencils participants helped pick up. As you can see here, those who listened to the prosocial song helped pick up more pencils than those who listened to the neutral song. The same effect was shown in a similar experiment, but this time people either played a video game with prosocial themes or a game without prosocial themes. The prosocial game was a game called Lemmings. Now, in this game, players must guide groups of small beings through different worlds and trying to help them survive. The goal is to take care of them, help them reach safely to the exit. And the neutral game was Tetris. Hopefully, I don't have to tell you what that is, but that's just a basic puzzle game. And after participants played either one of the games, the researchers had an actor drop a box of pencils again. And the researchers measured helping here by whether or not the participant offered to help. And as you can see here, twice as many people who played the prosocial video game, Lemmings, offered to help pick up pencils than those who had just played the neutral game, Tetris. And it's thought that exposure to prosocial media increases the accessibility of prosocial thoughts, which make it more likely that people will interpret situations as opportunities to help. So when people hear songs, watch movies, or play video games with prosocial characters, plot lines, or gameplay, people get a lot more helpful. Finally, let's turn to the environmental factors that influence helping behavior. The first I want to talk about is the geographical area people live in particular, whether a person lives in an urban or a rural area. As urbanism increases, so too does the likelihood that people will not help. In other words, as the population increases, the likelihood that people will help decreases. This was famously shown in an experiment where researchers had a child actor go up to people and say, "I'm lost, can you call my house?" They did this in 4 large cities, Boston, Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, and in 12 smaller towns in the nearby areas. And the results show that in the smaller towns, 72% of people approached to help the child, but only 46% of people approached in the urban areas helped the child. Why is this? Two explanations have been proposed, and both can be valid at the same time, of course. The first is stimuli overload. Urban areas have much more sights, sounds, and smells going on at one time than non-urban areas. And people are less prone to help in situations where they are being bombarded by extreme stimulation, such as now loud noises, which we'll talk about more later in a little bit. Furthermore, because of all the stimulation that exists in urban areas, people tend to keep to themselves in order to prevent becoming overwhelmed by all the stimulation. And thus, they only pay attention to things in their immediate environment that concern them. They get tunnel vision, as it were, and often don't even realize it when people need help. A second explanation involves feelings of personal security. People are, or at least feel, like they are more likely to be a victim of a crime or some sort of harassment in urban areas than they are when they are in non-urban areas. Thus, people in urban areas tend to be distrustful of strangers and avoid contact with others. This may explain why the people in the big cities didn't help the child as much as those in the small towns. Urbanites might have thought it was some scam or grift of some kind, while small town folks would not have had the suspicion. Another environmental factor that influences helping behavior is the cultural environment. Some cultures seem to have dominant prosocial values that encourage helping behavior and thus make it more likely that people in these cultures will help one another. For example, consider the value called simpatia that is common in Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries. Simpatia, which has no direct English translation, refers to a range of social and emotional traits, including being friendly, polite, good natured, pleasant, helpful toward others. So here's results from a study that lends some support that cultural environments can influence helping behavior. So a group of researchers went to several cities around the world and set up situations where people could offer help. There were 23 cities, and these are the top 10 cities that were most helpful, plus the only U.S. city, New York City, which ranked next to last. Half of the cities that ranked in the top 10 have the value of sympatia, as you see here, the ones that are bolded here. And that included Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, San Jose, Costa Rica, Madrid, Spain, Mexico City, and San Salvador. Right. And so, for example, in Rio de Janeiro was the most helpful city. And so in one case, they had a person drop a pin. 100% of people uh, helped told the person that they had dropped the pin in Rio de Janeiro. And another situation, they had a person who looked like they were hurt, and 80% of the people in Rio de Janeiro helped out. Then that ranked fourth. And then in another situation that looked like a blind person was trying to cross the street, uh, that person was helped in 100% of the situations in Rio de Janeiro, and so they ranked first. And you can just compare the numbers here. Now let's move on to the answers social psychologists have given for when people help. That is, if a person is in the presence of a situation in which another needs help, when will that person actually help? To answer this question, social psychologists have developed a bystander intervention model. A bystander is just a term for a person who is in the presence of someone in need. And according to this model, bystanders proceed through a series of 5 steps that determine whether they will offer help when in the presence of someone who needs help. According to this model, bystanders have to proceed through these 5 steps in order to actually offer help. However, there are several things that can happen that can make bystanders miss a step, thus leading them to not offer help when they are in presence of someone in need. So here's a graphical representation of the bystander intervention model. Here are the 5 steps. First, noticing that someone needs help. Second step is interpreting the situation as someone needing help. The third step is assuming the responsibility to provide help. The fourth step is having the knowledge to help. And the fifth step is deciding to actually help. As I said, for a person to go from being in the presence of someone needing help to actually offering help, bystanders have to go through all of these steps in order. The reasons bystanders don't follow a step are the reasons people don't help. So let's take this step by step. Let's start with the first step, which is noticing that someone needs help. For a bystander to help, they have to actually notice that someone is in their presence who needs help. And this makes perfect sense. A person is not going to offer help if they are completely unaware that someone around them actually needs help. Of course, our perception capabilities can be affected by many things in our immediate environment, and these things can make us not notice that someone needs help. For example, one study found that people in a hurry or in a rush, they're late for a meeting or whatever, are less likely to offer help than those who aren't in a hurry. People in a hurry are often very focused on getting to where they need to be, and this puts up blinders, so to speak, that prevent people from even noticing that they've passed by somebody that needs help. Another thing in our immediate environment that can affect whether we notice someone is in need of help is level of ambient noise. When it is very noisy, it makes it very hard for people to notice their immediate surroundings because of sensory overload. This sensory overload can cause people not to notice that a person needs help. This was shown in an experiment where researchers had a person in a cast drop a couple of books in the presence of participants in an outdoor area of a college campus. For half the participants, the ambient sound was normal. For the other participants, the researchers had a person run an old lawnmower with a broken muffler right near them. So very, very loud. And as you can see here, participants who were not exposed to a lot of loud noise in their immediate environment were very much more likely to offer the person with a cast help than those who were exposed to a lot of noise. 80% compared to 15%. Gigantic, gigantic difference. But let's say that a bystander actually notices a person who is in need of help. If this is the case, then the bystander moves to the next step, which is interpreting the situation as one in which someone needs help. So reality often doesn't speak for itself, and people have to interpret what the things they experience around them actually mean or indicate. That is, reality can be quite ambiguous, and thus a bystander often has to figure out if a person in their immediate presence actually needs help. So, kind of gauge this interpretation process, consider this little political cartoon of two people walking in the streets here in the city. And it starts off, oh no, that woman looks hurt. And I don't think so. She's homeless. It's cool. She doesn't have food or a place to go, but she isn't injured. Not a problem. And they walk away, right? And so they noticed this person who seemingly needs help, but they interpreted it as a situation in which they didn't need or need the help, or this person did not require their help. So again, just because you notice it doesn't mean you necessarily are going to help. You have to interpret it as a situation in which you need to help. Bystanders are most likely to interpret a situation as someone needing help when one or more of the following factors are at play. First, bystanders are more likely to interpret a situation as someone needing help when the incident is sudden and unexpected. For example, if a bystander sees someone pass out all of a sudden while standing up, she is more likely to interpret the situation as the person needing help than if the person is sitting down and passes out as if she were drifting off to sleep, even though that person could definitely need some help, perhaps. Second, bystanders are more likely to interpret a situation as someone needing help when there is a clear threat of harm. For instance, if a bystander sees someone else bleeding out, they are more likely to interpret the situation as this person needing help, since most people associate bleeding with serious injury. Of course, people can be seriously injured even though they are not bleeding out. It's called internal bleeding. Third, bystanders are more likely to interpret a situation as someone needing help when they believe that the harm to the victim will increase unless help is provided. For example, if a bystander sees someone else bleeding profusely, she is very likely to interpret the situation as someone needing her help, since many people are aware that a person can die if he suffers from too much blood loss. Finally, bystanders are more likely to interpret a situation as someone needing help when they believe that person in need of help needs assistance to get out of the situation. If someone is bleeding and passes out, a bystander is likely to interpret that event as an emergency, as that person does need help. However, if the bleeding person can get up and walk about, then the bystander is less likely to interpret the event as an emergency. Now, if you remember our discussion of informational influence earlier in the semester, you know that we often look around at others to figure out what is going on before we decide how to act or what to do. And bystanders do the same thing when trying to interpret whether or not a person in their presence needs their help. They look around at others in the situation for cues on whether they need to act. However, because everybody in the situation is doing this, they are basically waiting for other people to act. And this ends up freezing up everybody in the immediate area, preventing any one person from helping because each person tells him or herself, well, no one else is freaking out, so I shouldn't freak out, even though I am freaking out. But everybody's saying that, right? No one wants to act. No one wants to be the first person. And this creates a situation that we call pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance is when people think that everyone is interpreting the situation in a particular way, when in fact they are not. Pluralistic ignorance causes bystanders to assume that they don't need to do anything because they look at others and these others don't look concerned, even if internally they are actually quite as concerned. The effects of pluralistic ignorance on interpreting a situation as a situation in which a person needs help was shown famously in an experiment where participants were either put in a room alone or with two other people and told to complete a questionnaire. As the participants completed the questionnaire, the experimenters pumped smoke in the rooms the participants were in. They used smoke because many people, of course, interpret the presence of smoke in a building as an emergency. Might indicate a fire, of course. And the results show that 75% of people who were alone told the experimenters about the smoke within 6 minutes. However, only 38% of those in a room with two other people told the experimenters about the smoke. Why this big difference between 75% and 38%? Well, the experimenters argued that pluralistic ignorance was at play. Unsure whether the smoke signaled an actual emergency, participants who were with other people used each other as a source of information. And since the other two people in the room looked unconcerned because they too were reading the other people to see if the situation was actually an emergency, the participants ended up interpreting the event as a non-emergency because they assumed wrongly that everyone else knew what was going on. And since everyone else wasn't freaking out, then it must not have been an emergency. That was not going to be the case for people who were alone. They could only use themselves and come up with the interpretation on their own. They didn't have to look or didn't feel compelled to look at the reactions of other people. And so they acted, most of them acted immediately. So let's say that a bystander has noticed a person who needs help and has interpreted the situation as one in which they should give help. Even then, there is no guarantee the bystander will help. For the bystander to help, she has to complete the next step in the bystander intervention model, which is to assume the personal responsibility to help. If a bystander assumes personal responsibility for helping, then she is very likely to help. A very famous field experiment demonstrates this. In this field experiment, an actor went to the beach with a towel and a radio, back in the 60s, and laid them down next to another person. In one condition, the actor asked the person next to her if they would watch her radio. In the other condition, the actor said nothing to the person next to her. The actor then went swimming in the ocean. While the first actor was swimming, another actor came up and tried to take the radio. And when the person sitting next to the radio had agreed to watch it, thus taking personal responsibility, over 90% said something or tried to stop the second actor from taking the radio. When the person next to the radio was not asked to watch it and thus having accepted no personal responsibility, only about 20% said anything or tried to stop the second actor from taking the radio. So when you're in a coffee shop and you go to the bathroom and you ask the person next to you to watch your computer, your phone, or whatever, that actually does work. I mean, it's not foolproof, but it's going to work more than it's not. And the reason the more people are around, the less likely someone is to help is because of a phenomenon called the diffusion of responsibility. The diffusion of responsibility is the tendency to divide the responsibility to perform an action by the number of bystanders in a situation. In other words, as the number of bystanders increases, each bystander's sense of responsibility for helping in a situation decreases. So when there are many bystanders around, the bystanders think to themselves, I don't need to help in the situation because there's bound to be someone else here that will help since there are so many people. However, if all the bystanders think this way, then no one actually helps, ironically. However, if a bystander is the only person around to help, they cannot divide or divide the responsibility for helping amongst other bystanders or put the responsibility of helping on another bystanders, and thus they feel it incumbent upon themselves to help. The effects of the diffusion of responsibility on offering help were shown in an experiment where participants were put into individual cubicles and told to interact with other participants through an intercom system about college life. Some participants thought they were the only other person in the interaction. Other participants thought there were two other participants, and other participants thought there were four other participants. Now, unbeknownst to the participants, one of the participants in the interaction was actually just a pre-recorded voice. And during the interaction, the experimenters played a tape, so it sounded like the fake participant was having a seizure. The researchers wanted to see how the number of other bystanders a person thought was around would affect if and how fast people would seek out help for this person. So, as you can see from these results, 100% of the participants who thought that they were the only bystander notified the experimenter about the person having a seizure, and they did so quickly, as you can see here. However, this was not the case when the participants thought there were other bystanders. In fact, the more bystanders, the less likely people were helped. While over 80% of the participants in the two bystander condition eventually helped, and they did it relatively slowly, just over 60% in the four bystander condition eventually helped. And even then, those who did help did it relatively slowly. Interestingly, when people know about the phenomenon of the diffusion of responsibility, they are more likely to help in situations with many bystanders around. So if you actually are paying attention to this lecture and taking it to heart and remember it, when I, you are more likely to help in the future when there are a bunch of people around because you know now about the phenomenon, the diffusion of responsibility. You know that when there are a lot of people around, people aren't likely to help because they're waiting for someone else to react. You know that you have to be the one to do something. So maybe I've done a little good in the world by teaching you about this. Who knows? So let's say that a bystander notices that a person needs help, interprets the situation as one in which a person needs help, and feels personal responsibility to help. Again, this is no guarantee that the bystander will help. For the bystander to help, she has to complete the next stage of the bystander intervention model, which is knowing how to help. If people don't know how to help, then they often won't help, even if they want to. In certain situations, people are unsure of what exactly they can do to help. For example, many people know that a person having a seizure needs help, but many people don't know the correct way to respond to this situation. In other situations, people know what they need to do, but they don't know how to do it. For example, if a person stops breathing, most people know that they need to do some sort of CPR. However, just because a person knows that a person should receive CPR doesn't mean that she can actually perform it. This is the reason organizations like the Red Cross, others, uh, offer many, many classes and free classes on uh, CPR and using that heart attack machine, things like that, just so people, hopefully there'll be somebody around who knows how to do these things when somebody is in need of help, at least until the professionals show up. So let's say that a bystander notices that a person needs help, interprets the situation as one in which a person needs help, feels personal responsibility to help, and knows how to help. Again, still no guarantee that the bystander will help. For the bystander to help, she has to complete the final stage of the bystander intervention model, which is to actually make the decision to help. Now, why might a bystander not decide to help? Well, there are two big reasons. The first reason is because of what's called evaluation apprehension. Evaluation apprehension is the fear of being judged negatively by others when acting publicly. Evaluation apprehension can inhibit people because bystanders fear that others will view their intervention as foolish, stupid, or wrong. For example, a person might decide not to start CPR on a person who's stopped breathing because she might feel that others will think she's doing it wrong or that she is going overboard with her attempts at helping. All the comedies and comedic movies that showed people, doing CPR um, on people who didn't need it, really sort of highlight this notion of evaluation apprehension. The second reason bystanders decide not to help is because they believe it is too costly to help. When deciding whether to help, bystanders weight the cost of helping to the cost of not helping and act accordingly. This is captured in the cost model of helping decision making. So here's the model right here. It's represented in this table with the cost of not helping in the row and the cost of helping in the column, as you can see here. When the costs of not helping are high, but the costs for helping are low, bystanders will directly intervene and help. For example, if a person's girlfriend falls down, he will usually help her up immediately because it's little cost to do so, and not doing so can bring a lot of costs, like a very heated argument or a breakup. However, when the costs of both helping and not helping are low, the model predicts people's helping behavior will be guided by social norms. For example, opening the door for someone a person doesn't know involves little cost one way or the other. However, it is common in our society to hold the door open for the elderly and those on crutches. When the costs for helping and not helping are both high, the model predicts people will do indirect intervention. For example, it might cost a person a lot to get in the middle of a fight involving a close friend, but it might cost a lot if the person doesn't help, in that they might lose the friendship for not helping out in some way. In these cases, people will usually indirectly intervene, say by going to the bouncer in the club or to the cop in the street to end the fight. Finally, the model predicts that the situation where people are least likely to help is when the costs of helping are high and the costs of not helping are low. In these situations, people often just leave or ignore the situation. For example, if a person sees a guy he doesn't know getting his ass kicked, he will more likely leave or ignore the situation than actually help. This is because it is high cost for him to intervene, potentially getting his ass kicked himself, and it costs little if he doesn't help, since he doesn't know the guy, he doesn't risk losing a friendship. Pluralistic ignorance, the diffusion of responsibility, and evaluation apprehension help explain what's called the bystander effect. The bystander effect is the finding that as the number of bystanders increases, the likelihood that any one bystander will offer help decreases. This is counter to what common sense might predict. The more people around, the more likely there will be someone to actually help, but this isn't the case. Because of pluralistic ignorance, when other bystanders are around, the more an individual bystander will use the reactions of others to figure out what to do. When there's nobody else around, a bystander is more likely to come to their own conclusion that a person is in need of help. Because of the diffusion of responsibility, the more bystanders around, the more the responsibility to help is divided between bystanders. And thus, when you have a lot of bystanders, the responsibility gets divided up so much that no one bystander feels any responsibility to help on their part. A bystander tells himself, I surely don't need to call 911. I'll let someone else do it because someone surely is going to do it. But if everyone thinks like this, then ironically, no one actually calls 911. And finally, more bystanders means more people around to potentially judge and ridicule one's efforts to help. This causes bystanders who might want to help to think twice about helping because they don't want to be seen as stupid or foolish in the eyes of others. And this is why evaluation apprehension contributes to the bystander effect. So, how do you counter the bystander effect? By countering the reasons for the bystander effect. To counter pluralistic ignorance, you have to make it very clear that someone is in need of help. Leave no ambiguity about the situation. To counter the diffusion of responsibility, you have to call out individual bystanders and put the responsibility on them. And to counter evaluation apprehension, you have to tell people what they can actually do to help. And if you've come this far in this lecture and in this course, if you want 2 points added to your final grade, send me a picture of Spider-Man. Finally, let's look at some of the answers social psychologists have given for the last question regarding prosocial behavior, which is, how do people react to being helped? That is, what do people think and how do they feel when they've been helped by others? Now, most people think those they help will be very grateful and thankful for the help they've received. And much of the time, this is the case. People receiving help are often able to achieve their goals because of the help, like when a student gets a good grade on a paper because they asked for help, from a tutor at the writing center. Also, people are sometimes able to avoid catastrophe because they've been helped by others. Like when a person gives someone who can't pay their own rent some money, or when a person pushes another person out of the way of an oncoming bus. In these situations, people who receive help tend to be very grateful and thankful and very happy to have received the help. However, sometimes people who receive help don't experience positive feelings and emotions when they receive help. In fact, they experience the opposite. People who receive help sometimes experience sadness when they receive help, and sometimes people who receive help actually start to resent those who've helped them. Why is that the case? Well, there are several reasons. First, receiving help can create situations of perceived inequity. An inequitable situation is when one person in a relationship is getting more rewards and/or putting in uh, less costs into the relationship than the other person. In other words, an inequitable relationship is one where one person is benefiting much more from the relationship than the other person is. People don't like being in equitable relationships one way or the other, as we discussed when we talked about interpersonal relationships. People don't like benefiting too much in a relationship, and people don't like getting too little out of a relationship. People who receive help from another feel like they are benefiting too much in a relationship, which makes them feel negative feelings and emotions because they believe they are taking advantage, so to speak, of the other person in the relationship. This is especially the case when people don't feel like they can reciprocate or pay back the help. In fact, many people who need help will not seek out help if they don't believe they can reciprocate or pay back this help. That people are hesitant to ask for help when they don't think they can reciprocate or pay back the help was shown in an experiment where the researchers brought in participants and told them to work on a task with another person who was actually a confederate of the researcher. The researchers told the participants that they could ask for help from the other participant if they wanted to. However, half the participants were told there would be no opportunity to help the confederate later on in the experiment, but the other half were told they would be able to help the confederate later on in the experiment. And here are the results. As you can see here, participants who thought they were able to reciprocate or pay back help were much more likely to ask for help from the Confederates than participants who didn't think they could reciprocate or pay back the help. Right? Almost the sort of reversed, as you see here, depending on if they were able to reciprocate the help versus not able to reciprocate the help. Another reason people sometimes experience sadness and resentment when receiving help is because receiving help threatens people's sense of freedom. As you might remember from earlier in this course, psychological reactance is a situation where people react very negatively when they feel their freedom to do what they want to do is being inhibited in some way. Accepting help can cause psychological reactance in that accepting help may make people feel like they have to act in certain ways. For example, accepting help, especially when there are conditions for receiving the help, when there are strings attached, so to speak, can make people feel as if their freedom is threatened. Moreover, there are often norms that prescribe returning help in the future and prescribe acting deferential to those who've helped in the past, all of which inhibits one's ability to do what one wants. This anticipation of having one's freedom threatened by accepting help actually prevents many people from accepting help. And this was shown in an experiment where participants were offered a scholarship. However, half of the participants were told that to get the scholarship, they would have to participate in an elaborate and lengthy public campaign about the scholarship, which would be quite a high behavioral cost and thus a threat to a person's freedom to act how they want to in the future. The other half were told that they would just have to report their grades each semester, which would be a low behavioral cost and thus not much of a threat to a person's freedom. And as you can see here, around 2/3 of those who had a low cost requirement for the scholarship accepted the scholarship, but under half accepted the scholarship even when there was a high behavioral cost. So people will turn down basically free money if you put too many conditions on it, right? If you make, if you inhibit how they might act in the future. Finally, receiving help can cause feelings of sadness and resentment because receiving help can threaten people's self-esteem. As you might imagine, receiving help can cause people to experience feelings of failure and inferiority for having to receive help. For example, having to go to the writing center for help means admitting that you're not such a great writer, which can cause one to judge oneself quite negatively, especially if being a good writer is an important part of one's self-concept. Receiving help especially can lead to feelings of low self-esteem when those offering the help are similar to those receiving the help. When people receive help from someone who seems similar to them, even if that similarity is relatively superficial, they tend to feel lower self-esteem than when they receive help from someone who is dissimilar from them. This was shown in an experiment where people played a stock market simulation and were made to fail. And to continue, the participants would need to get more poker chips from another person playing the game in the room. And the researchers made some of these others seem very similar to the participants by saying that they scored almost identically on an attitude questionnaire. And they made other participants seem very dissimilar to the participants by saying they scored very differently on an attitude questionnaire. So manipulating the perceived similarity. And after the participants played the stock market game, the researchers then asked the participants to fill out a self-esteem questionnaire. And as you can see here, those that received help from a similar other reported experiencing lower self-esteem than those who received help from dissimilar others. It is, 6 percentage points, but well within significant difference. But why does people's self-esteem take such a hit when they accept help from similar others? It's because people often compare themselves to people who they believe are similar to themselves, as you remember from social comparison theory. And accepting help from similar others means to many that they are not so similar to others as they thought. People ask themselves, if I'm so similar to this person, why can they do this and I can't? For example, if you believe you and your friend are pretty similar in intelligence, and you have to ask your friend for help for your math homework, maybe you start coming to the conclusion you are not as smart as you think you are, or you're not as smart as your friend is. And this may cause your self-esteem to take a hit, especially if being smart, being intelligent is an important part of your self-concept. Okay, well, that'll do it for our lecture on prosocial behavior. See you next time.